Of all the elections in American history, the 1948 election is definitely one of the most interesting and one of the most fascinating, honestly. And if you were alive during that time, it was definitely one of the biggest upsets ever. Almost every political analyst was expecting Thomas Dewey, the challenger who was the governor of New York and a Republican, to win the election. Not only win the election, but win it by a landslide considering how unpopular President Harry Truman was. But Truman ultimately won in what was the biggest upset in American history. Well, at least until Donald Trump came along. But anyway, this was a massive upset. And this wasn't just some 187 to 186 electoral college win. By all accounts, this was an electoral college landslide. And although the popular vote was certainly close, Truman did win the electoral college by a pretty significant amount, and Dewey only won 16 states. And a huge reason for this was because Truman was an extremely effective campaigner, while Dewey ran an abysmal campaign and took his lead too much for granted and was overtly cautious. Dewey's loss led many Republicans to wonder if they had nominated the right candidate, would they have beaten Truman not just by winning the presidency, but also beaten him in a landslide. And many of these more conservative Republicans were also angry with Dewey's moderation or even liberalism from their perspective. And their desired candidate from the beginning was not Dewey or even Robert Taft, who was the leader of the conservative coalition, but Douglas MacArthur, the popular general from World War II, who basically controlled all of Japan following the war. Douglas MacArthur was the favorite of many hard right conservatives, even above Robert Taft, despite Douglas MacArthur not having the same isolationist views as them. MacArthur himself actually wanted to run for president, but ultimately didn't really have much of a shot to, because largely due to the fact that Harry Truman intentionally tried to delay peace in Japan for as long as possible to delay MacArthur's return home to the United States because he knew the threat MacArthur posed to him as a presidential candidate from the Republican Party. So, to prevent MacArthur from returning to the United States, Truman ultimately tried to delay peace with Japan so he would stay there for a longer time. However, had Truman not done so, it is very possible MacArthur would have returned to America much earlier and would have been able to run a campaign for president in 1948. And given his status as a war hero and popularity among more hardline conservatives, it is very, very possible that MacArthur would win the Republican Party nomination. So let's say Douglas MacArthur is the GOP nominee. I would suspect that as a running mate in 1948, MacArthur would select Arthur Vandenberg, the very powerful senator from Michigan. Vandenberg had a ton of influence in the Senate and could help MacArthur open up with some more insiders in the Republican Party who would be wary of him. Plus, Vandenberg also had ties to the conservative wing of the party, which would only bolster MacArthur's standing with the right wing base. And overall, Vandenberg was also very loyal to MacArthur, having supported him in 1944 and actually encouraged him to run against FDR and tried to set up a draft MacArthur movement that ultimately didn't go anywhere. But still, selecting Vandenberg would be a huge plus for MacArthur. Plus, it would help him in the Midwestern states such as Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, which would all be considered swing states at selection. Ultimately, the first polls that would be taken would show MacArthur winning by a landslide, ultimately winning every state outside of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Minnesota, and the South. Plus, Strom Thurmond would still run as the Dixiecrats nominee out of frustration over Harry Truman's civil rights policies. However, Truman would still have a very good chance to win, just like in our own scenario, because polling would still show MacArthur as having somewhat narrow leads in many of these states, and the Truman campaign would view many of these states as winnable, with the exception, of course, as the states outlined in dark red. Ultimately, in real life, Truman himself was very afraid of the prospect of MacArthur becoming president, and he also was also very well aware of his own unpopularity. And in real life, Truman was very willing to even offer himself as vice president to Dwight Eisenhower and encouraged him to run to replace him, by the way, in the 1948 presidential election as a Democrat. Ultimately, MacArthur wasn't the nominee, so this wouldn't happen, but Eisenhower very well could have ran in 1948 as a Democrat if MacArthur was the Republican nominee, considering how the DNC was held just 1 month after the RNC. And this would be a little bit sufficient time for Eisenhower to prepare for the DNC. But ultimately, I don't know if Eisenhower still would have wanted to run, even if MacArthur was the nominee. He was very uninterested in running in 1948, and he didn't even identify as a Democrat. He was more inclined towards the Republican Party, as we saw in 1952 when he ran for and won their nomination. And I don't know if Truman would actually go through with this. So I think it would be more likely that Truman just stays on the ticket as the Democratic Party's nominee for president, despite opposition to him from the Democrats, both conservative and progressive ones, as well as a desire to find a better candidate. With Truman ultimately being the nominee, he would actually still run the same campaign, I think, with probably even more aggression, considering how he would try to take down the label of MacArthur as a popular war hero. So Truman would likely tour all across the United States, going through bus stops and whistle tours, and would very well campaign in areas such as the Midwest and West, where many political commentators would write him off. Douglas MacArthur, though, would still be a very formidable candidate, mostly due to his popularity as a war general, and in real life, Harry Truman decisively won veterans returning from World War II. This would not be the same, though, in this alternate scenario, because MacArthur himself, being a general in World War II, would likely do very well with the returning veteran vote that was key in many of these swing states. Ultimately, though, I do believe the election would narrow down, and MacArthur would still have a slight advantage, although it would be significantly closer than it was earlier. This is in part due to MacArthur's weaknesses himself, which largely stem from his lack of political experience, but he's very weak in three particular issues. The first being labor unions. MacArthur represented the very conservative wing of the Republican Party, and although he didn't really formulate that many views of unions as his own, he would likely be a lot weaker on the issue than Thomas Dewey was. His stance on the Do Nothing Congress would also be particularly weak, considering how his running mate, Arthur Vandenberg, would be considered as a part of the Do Nothing Congress, considering his very influential role in the United States Senate. And then finally, regarding the prospect of nuclear weapons, MacArthur himself in 1952 was more than willing to nuke China. Truman ultimately stopped him from doing this and fired him. However, I think MacArthur would make a numerous amounts of gaffes regarding the issue of nuclear weapons in the 1948 election. He would likely call for nuking the Soviet Union or something along the lines, which would ultimately be extremely controversial and would hurt him severely in the polls. I think Truman would do messaging that would be very similar to LBJ's in 1964 regarding Goldwater, where Truman would try to portray MacArthur as an extremist, especially regarding nuclear weapons. And you could see stuff like the Daisy ad, even though I'm not sure this quality of advertisement was available in 1948. You would see very similar stuff to this. Ultimately, right before the election, with MacArthur's weaknesses on these issues, the polls would ultimately have Truman narrowly winning the election in what would be a stunning reversal from what the initial polls were looking like. Truman would have a very narrow lead over MacArthur, but again, this would be anybody's race, as when breaking down the swing states and classifying them as toss-ups, you would ultimately see that either MacArthur or Truman had a shot to win, considering the closeness of this election. Ultimately, though, when considering the states that would be more likely than not go to Truman and MacArthur respectively, you would see that Truman would have a significant advantage and would just be 11 electoral votes away from winning. All he would need to do is win one of the three states of Illinois, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, along with the states he's already favored in, and he becomes president of the United States. In real life, Thomas Dewey did win the state of New York. However, this was again due to his status as governor there, and thus I heavily doubt MacArthur's views would allow him to win a state like New York. And California, additionally, was largely competitive due to the fact that Dewey's running mate in real life was Earl Warren, who was the popular governor from that state, and MacArthur's running mate is not Warren in this scenario. And Truman anyways won California, so I do believe he would be heavily favored in that state. Ultimately, this would nonetheless be viewed as a neck-and-neck race, and analysts would likely be split between deciding who would win between Truman and MacArthur. Ultimately, though, when the election results come in, it would not be nice for Douglas MacArthur. After several close calls in multiple swing states, such as the states of Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa, as well as New Hampshire, where he would be heavily favored to win before the election. Ultimately, he would only narrowly scrape by victories in these states. Truman's messaging regarding nuclear weapons would prove to be very effective. Also, states like Pennsylvania and Delaware, which were expected to go to him, would become a lot more close and would still be too close to call. And the state of Connecticut, which would be favored to go to MacArthur, would ultimately surprisingly go to Harry Truman. This would be a very close election, and many of the western states also, which analysts would predict MacArthur to win easily, would be too close to call. Ultimately, Harry Truman would come out with a resounding victory, winning in an electoral college landslide, with MacArthur not really doing that much better than Thomas Dewey in 1944, and actually doing worse than him in 1948. This would be a stunning reversal of initial polls that had MacArthur at 350. Now, the actual results show Harry Truman with 354 electoral votes. MacArthur would still surprisingly win the same number of states as Dewey did in 1948, although he would have significantly less electoral college votes due to losing the more populous eastern states while winning less populated western states. So there you go. This would be the final results. It would be a resounding victory for Harry Truman, who would ultimately be able to use his status as incumbent president, as well as successfully frame MacArthur as an extremist regarding nuclear weapons, just like LBJ did to Goldwater, to win the election in an electoral college landslide. The popular vote, I do believe, would be close, but I think Truman would still have a pretty significant popular vote victory, likely around 5 to 6 points, much more than he did over Thomas Dewey. And there you go. It would be another comeback victory for Harry Truman, who would probably be waving the newspaper that says MacArthur defeats Truman. So thanks everyone for watching this video. Make sure to like this video down below and subscribe to the channel. Mr. US History, out.